Sometimes justice doesn't walk in with a badge or a gavel. Sometimes it walks in wearing old sneakers and carrying a folded letter. This is the story of a woman they tried to underestimate and a brother they tried to erase. Before we begin, if you believe in stories that speak truth to power, that give voice to the unheard, take a moment to subscribe. It helps us keep telling the kind of stories that matter. Now, let me tell you what happened when Camille Hayes walked into a jail, just to visit her brother, and walked out with the warden in handcuffs. The rain had let up, but the sky still carried that leaden gray that made everything beneath it feel heavier. The Jefferson County Correctional Facility squatted on the edge of the city like a forgotten scarlo slung, concrete and perpetually damp. A seagull circled above it, lost. As if even nature avoided this place on purpose, Camille Hayes stepped out of her rented Nissan Altima, clutching a simple paper bag and a thin folder tucked tightly under one arm. She wore a faded navy hoodie zipped all the way up, sleeves too long, hands partially hidden. Her jeans were worn at the knees, and her sneakers had that kind of quiet age that said they had walked too many sidewalks in cities where no one said, "Excuse me." She looked like any other visitor, nervous, quiet, purposeful. But what they didn't know, what none of them could possibly know, was that she had rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 different ways over the last 17 days. Every step she took toward that entrance wasn't just physical. It was history, memory. Rage kept on ice. Inside the facility, the fluorescent lights hummed and flickered with the indifference of bureaucracy. The lobby smelled of floor wax, institutional coffee, and resignation. A pot of half-warmed coffee, set on a steel counter like it had been brewed during the Bush administration. A vending machine buzzed faintly in the corner, its candy bars slouched in their coils, waiting for someone desperate enough to risk disappointment. Behind the thick glass of the front desk sat a corrections officer with a gut that made his belt buckle tilt. His name tag read S. Doyle, and his eyes didn't even bother to rise when Camille approached. He was too focused on whatever was happening on his cracked phone screen. Probably a low-resolution sports highlight. Or worse. Camille stood silently for a moment, letting the silence stretch like a tightrope. Then she cleared her throat. Just once. He still didn't look up. "Visitation hours ended 20 minutes ago," he said, voice flat, without inflection. The kind of voice that could say your house is on fire and we're out of napkins, with equal weight. "I'm not here for visitation," Camille said, her tone polite but firm. She unfolded the piece of paper slowly, deliberately, and slid it under the partition glass. Doyle looked at it like she'd handed him a napkin someone sneezed on. But something about the letterhead caught his eye. His posture changed. He sat up straighter. "What's this?" "You'll want to read it," she said, her voice calm. "Page 2 is the authorization." He opened the folded document and scanned the top. His eyes narrowed, then widened. He looked at her again, this time really looked. The hoodie, the bag, the sneakers, it was camouflage, and it had worked. For a second, a flicker of something passed across his face. Recognition? Alarm? "You with internal affairs?" he asked, his voice dropping a note lower, as if saying it too loudly might summon trouble from the vents. Camille said nothing. She let his imagination do the heavy lifting. That was always more effective than explanation. Before Doyle could speak again, another guard came around the corner, younger, tall, square-jawed, probably fresh from some police academy that handed out certificates like Halloween candy. His nameplate read M. King. He smirked the moment he saw her. "You can't bring food in here," he said, pointing at the paper bag in her hand. "This ain't your grandma's kitchen." Still, Camille didn't respond. King took a step closer, his boots echoing on the linoleum. "Seriously? You think you're gonna bribe someone with a sandwich? What is that chicken salad? You gotta be kidding me." He reached for the bag, all swagger and cheap intimidation. Camille's hand shot up, Not to strike, not to defend, just to stop. Don't, she said. Just that. One syllable sharpened to a blade. King hesitated. Not because he was afraid yet, but because something in her voice had weight. The kind of weight that made people rethink their tone. His hand froze. In midair. Who even are you? He asked. SEO, FFING. Camille leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper, but as steady as a courtroom gavel. Someone who knows exactly what happens in your solitary confinement unit, she said. Someone who's read the grievances, who's listened to recordings, who's watched footage you thought you erased. That got him. She saw it in the micro-expression, jaw twitching, brow lifting ever so slightly, eyes darting for half a second toward the hallway behind him, and just like that, the entire room felt like it inhaled and forgot how to exhale. Coffee machines stopped gurgling. The air conditioner hiccuped. Somewhere a chair squeaked. But no one spoke. Doyle stood up now. Ma'am, he said slowly, we're gonna need to call Warden Gillen. I'd appreciate that, Camille interrupted, setting her folder down on the desk with a quiet finality. I believe he's expecting me. But that was a lie. Warden Gillen wasn't expecting her at all. And that was exactly the way she wanted it. The silence stretched for a beat too long. Then Doyle cleared his throat. Well, why don't you have a seat over there, Ms.? But Camille had already turned away and sat down on the narrow metal bench along the wall. The cushion was cracked and flattened from years of disinterest. She placed the paper bag beside her, adjusted her hoodie, and clasped her hands together, an image of calm, maybe even patience. But her eyes never stopped moving. Through the security glass, she watched the two men whisper to each other. King was still puffed up, irritated, trying to reassert himself, but Doyle was sweating now. His finger hovered above the intercom button like it might burn him. After a moment, he pressed it. Warden Gillen? Yeah, you're gonna want to come to the front lobby. There was a pause on the other end. Why? Doyle glanced back at Camille. She says she's with internal. Another pause. Then, don't move her. I'm coming. Click. Camille leaned back. She had timed this perfectly. The paper she presented was real but carefully worded. It gave her clearance as a civilian consultant working with DOJ oversight, not as a formal inspector. Which meant she didn't technically have the authority to demand access. But it would take too long for the average corrections officer to figure that out. And by the time anyone read the fine print, she would already have what she needed. It was a chess game, and she was already 5 moves ahead. A door buzzed open 15 minutes later, and in walked Warden Mitchell Gillen, all 5'11", of self-importance. His navy blazer was too tight at the stomach, and the stripes on his tie looked like a flag at half-mast. He had that cop-look, short, cropped gray hair, tight jaw, and the permanent scowl of a man who never forgot being overlooked. In high school, he spotted Camille instantly. Ms. Hayes, he said, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. What a surprise. Camille stood up. I'm here to see my brother. I see that. He walked toward her, motioning the guards away. You know, most family members go through official visitation channels. Don't usually need a DOJ stamp just to say hello. She tilted her head. And most wardens don't keep a 19-year-old cadet with no priors in solitary for 3 nights without incident reports. That wiped the smile off his face. You've been doing your homework, he muttered. I had good reason to. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Diane Hayes is on my list. I think you know what that means. He glanced at Doyle, who shrugged. She showed paperwork. Didn't touch anything. Gillen returned his gaze to Camille. You want to come back with me to my office? Yes. He gestured toward the door. Leave the bag. She looked at the paper bag beside her. Inside was a turkey sandwich, wrapped in wax paper, and a voice recorder sewn into the bottom. She stood and left it where it was. I don't need it anymore, she said. They walked in silence down a narrow hallway. Surveillance cameras watched from the corners. Camille noted every guard they passed, every locked door, every low mutter of conversation. The further in they went, the more the air changed. It thickened, grew heavier by the time they reached the administration wing. Her breath had slowed, her heart steady. She had imagined this exact walk every night since the first call from Dayon's public defender. She had dreamed it. Now it was real. Gillen's office was larger than she expected. Too clean. Leather chairs. A framed quote from Teddy Roosevelt. On the wall, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Fitting, he sat behind his desk. She remained standing. "Let me save us both some time," she began. "You've had 6 civil complaints in the last year. 3 of them for use of force in solitary confinement. The surveillance footage is always missing. The medical logs are always delayed. The paperwork always shows compliance." He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. But this time," she said, pulling out her phone, "you made a mistake." She tapped play. A muffled audio recording filled the air. It was scratchy, but clear enough. "Put that boy back in the hole. Let him cry to his mama. Don't stop until he bleeds." The voice was his. Gillen's jaw clenched. "That's inadmissible. You can't." "It's not for court," she said. "It's for Washington. And I brought copies." He stood up now, pacing. "You lied to get in here." "No," she said, calm as before. "I didn't say I was here in an official capacity. I said I was here to see my brother. Everything after that, you walked into it." He paused. "You're bluffing." She reached into her folder, pulled out 3 manila envelopes, each marked with a date and case number. "These are witness statements from other inmates. One of them used to work your kitchen." He heard the screams through the vent. She placed them on the desk like playing cards. "And this," she said, sliding over a 4th folder, "is the last photo taken of Dayon before you put him in solitary." She opened it. Gillen's face changed, because in the photo, Dayon is smiling. Healthy, clear-eyed, still wearing his cadet ring. A young man with a future. And now, he was barely speaking. Black and blue along the ribs. Medical unit said he fell. Camille had seen those kinds of falls before. "In war zones. I want him released to general population by tonight," she said. "Medical check within the hour. Full report sent to DOJ Central." He didn't respond. "You can call your lawyer," she offered. "But know this, if my brother's condition doesn't improve by morning, I go public. Not just with your voice, but with everything." He stared at her. "You think they'll care?" Camille stepped closer. "I don't care if they do," she said. "But when this goes public, they'll care who else you buried in solitary. Then," she smiled, just faintly, "and I've got time to dig." Gillen stood still, hands pressed against the edge of his desk. For the first time in a long while, he looked unsure. Warden wasn't used to being the least powerful person in the room, especially not when the person sitting across from him wasn't wearing a badge, wasn't flanked by federal agents, wasn't raising her voice or slamming fists. Camille simply waited. Silence could do more than shouting ever could. Finally, Gillen exhaled through his nose and walked over to the small cabinet in the corner, poured himself a glass of water. The clinking of ice against the glass was the only sound between them for several seconds. He took a sip, turned toward her again. "You really think you're going to make a difference?" he asked. "You walk in here with a hoodie and some folders, and what, just blow the roof off the place? You think that's how the system works?" "No," she said, tilting her head. "I know that's not how it works. That's why I'm not trying to blow the roof off. I'm digging underneath it." She stepped forward now, slow and steady, like she had all day. "You built this place on fear," she said. "Fear of inmates, fear of oversight, fear that someone might one day hold you accountable. But the thing is, Mitchell, may I call you Mitchell? Your fear made you sloppy. She picked up one of the folders again. This one. You signed off on a restraint order for a man who was legally blind. Said he attacked staff. But the report doesn't match the medical record, and he was in a wheelchair. It took me 6 minutes to find the contradiction. She held up another. And here, you approved a 48-hour isolation for a 17-year-old awaiting trial. He hadn't even seen a judge yet. Guess what? The footage? Still on the server. You forgot to purge July backups. She let the folders fall back onto the desk one by one. Thump, thump, thump. Gillen's expression was hardening again, but now it was more out of habit than conviction. The mask was slipping. Underneath wasn't rage. It was fear. Camille stepped even closer, lowering her voice. I'm not some activist with a phone camera. I'm not a blogger looking for clout. I've sat across from congressmen who begged me to bury things deeper. I've been in rooms where files were burned. And you know what I learned? She leaned in. Every bully thinks the system protects him until the system needs a scapegoat. His jaw clenched. She could see the sweat starting to form at his temples. The man who had bragged on security tape about breaking them until they bleed was now calculating his next PR move. You can play hardball, she said. Or you can walk out of here with a retirement package and a non-disclosure agreement. He looked at her, really looked. For the first time, not as a woman. Not as black. Not as a visitor. But as something more dangerous. An equal. He sat down. Slowly. What do you want? She didn't blink. Full medical exam for Diane within the hour. Moved back to general. Visitation privileges restored. She ticked them off on her fingers. Suspensions for officers King and Doyle pending review. Audio logs turned over to Doge within 48 hours. And you, she paused. You announce your retirement at the end of the month. Citing personal reasons, not scandal, Gillen laughed once. It was bitter. You came prepared. I came angry, she said. Preparation was just the logical next step. There was a long pause. He looked at the folders. Looked at the wall. The quote from Roosevelt stared back at him. Speak softly and carry a big stick. Maybe that had been his motto once. But now the stick was in someone else's hands. He nodded. Double fine. Done. Good, Camille replied, as if it were the most casual thing in the world. She pulled out a final document from her folder already printed, signature line at the bottom. Your retirement letter. I left the date blank. Fill it in. As he took the pen and scrawled his name across the line, Camille looked out the office. Window. A guard led 2 inmates in shackles across the yard. One of them looked up, just a kid, couldn't be older than 20. Face bruised. Eyes dulled. She watched him for a long moment. Then she turned back to Gillen. By the way, she said, the turkey sandwich had a listening device. It's in your break room now. Still recording. Gillen's pen froze. She smiled. Don't worry. It's just for my personal notes. 43 minutes later, Diane Hayes was wheeled into the medical ward. Bruised ribs, minor dehydration, and most concerning, a fractured wrist no one had documented. The nurse who examined him whispered an apology before injecting the painkillers. He nodded, too tired to speak. Camille stood behind the glass, watching. She hadn't cried when she first saw him. She hadn't cried when she heard his voice on the call that started all this. But now, watching him blink up at the ceiling safe. Treated, human again, her chest tightened in that strange, sharp way grief sometimes does when it finally feels like it can breathe. A young corrections officer passed by. He stopped. Did a double take and said, "Wait, are you the lady from D.C.?" Camille glanced at him, eyebrows raised. He smiled sheepishly. They've been whispering about you all morning. Someone said you made the warden sign his own pink slip. She shrugged. I didn't make him. He just realized it was time. The officer hesitated, then nodded. Good. he said, almost to himself. It's about time someone looked. 2 hours after that, Camille walked out of the facility the same way she entered, hoodie up, folder under one arm, but something had shifted. This time, they held the door open for her. No one smirked. No one rolled their eyes. The lobby was quiet. The guard at the front desk, a different one now, stood as she passed, nodded once, and said, "Thank you, ma'am." She nodded back, didn't smile, didn't stop walking. The sky outside was still overcast, the clouds low and silver. But to Camille, it felt brighter somehow. Because justice, like sunlight, finds a way in, even through concrete, even through prisons, even through silence. They said nothing when she passed, and yet, they said everything. Camille could feel it, those glances, weighted and sharp, sliding across her skin like invisible barbs. The corridor leading from administration back toward the exit was narrow, institutional, and cold. The kind of cold that didn't come from air conditioning, but from presence, from posture, from the way back stiffened and conversation stopped the moment she turned the corner. She didn't need to hear their words. Their silence was more eloquent. A white female guard at the records desk paused her typing as Camille approached. Didn't speak. Didn't nod. Just let her eyes track Camille from her curly bun down to her worn sneakers, lingering long enough to register judgment, then shifted her gaze back to the screen deliberately. Further down the hall, an older man in a corrections uniform, his skin pale and his mustache thick with gray, stood arms folded beside the door to the break room. When Camille neared, he didn't move, didn't offer space. His chin tilted back slightly, as if to say, "You can pass, but only because I let you." Camille slowed. Stopped inches from him. Their eyes met. And for a moment, there was something primal and unspoken. Race, gender, authority, defiance, all compressed into a gaze that lasted barely 3 seconds, but felt like a standoff in a saloon. He finally shifted. Just enough for her to move by, but not enough to acknowledge her. Camille didn't flinch. She didn't nod. She didn't even blink. She simply walked past like mist past a stone, and that, she knew, was what infuriated them the most. She didn't play their game. By the time she stepped out into the secondary security foyer, the younger guards had heard. Word in prisons travels faster than light. You can't keep secrets in places built to conceal them. Camille's story, the woman who walked in like a nobody and walked out with the warden's retirement letter in her pocket, was now legend. She was no longer invisible. And in a place like Jefferson County Correctional Facility, being visible meant being targeted. 2 guards in their mid-20s stood behind the X-ray belt, pretending to monitor the scanner. But one whispered something just loud enough for her to hear. Guess affirmative action finally got teeth. The other chuckled and replied, "She probably only got that badge because she cried at a hearing." Camille paused mid-step. Not because of the insult, but because of how familiar it all was. She turned slightly and smiled. "Keep talking," she said softly. "I record everything." They froze. She didn't need to show proof. She was the proof. On the way out, she passed the janitor. Again the same black woman who had slid her that water bottle hours earlier. Her name tag now visible. L. Sims. Sims was scrubbing near the vending machine, one hand wrapped in a worn glove, the other balancing a mop bucket. When she looked up and saw Camille, something shifted in her shoulders. It wasn't pride exactly, more like recognition. A quiet "I see you" from one woman to another, bonded by something deeper than words. Camille slowed. "Thank you," she said. Sims shrugged like it was nothing, but her eyes glistened. "About time somebody saw what goes on in here," she muttered. Then, after a pause, "They ain't used to someone walking in with fire and walking out still lit." Camille gave a small nod. Neither was I. Outside, the air had changed. It wasn't just the weather, though the clouds had started to break, letting streaks of gold wash across the parking lot. It was something in her lungs, in her steps, in the way her breath felt when it left her. Body not tight, not heavy. Diane was still inside, but he was healing, and that meant Camille could exhale, if only for a moment. She reached her car, opened the door, and froze. On the windshield was a note, scrawled in thick Sharpie on a torn page. Of a guard roster sheet. It read, "Don't come back. You got lucky this time." Camille stared at it. Then folded it neatly. Placed it inside the same folder as Gillen's retirement letter, because threats only have power when they're hidden. She kept everyone, like evidence, like scars, like armor. The hotel lobby wasn't much better. Camille stepped into the minimalist marble and chrome of the Wyndham North, the kind of business hotel that tried to look upscale, but always smelled faintly of over-polished ambition. She was barely 5 steps in when the front desk manager, a young white woman with a name tag that read Jenna, locked eyes with her and stiffened. Camille had checked in 2 days prior under a government rate. Her name was on file. Her card on hold, but now Jenna leaned forward, her voice coated in fake sugar. "Hi, ma'am. Can I help you?" Camille looked around. There were no other guests in the lobby. "I'm already a guest." "Room 402. Jenna smiled wider, eyes narrowing. "Oh, I just didn't recognize you out of uniform." There it was. Camille was still in the hoodie, the same jeans. Her hair slightly windblown, curls loosening. But what Jenna saw wasn't a guest. It was a woman who looked like she didn't belong in places with room service. Camille tilted her head. "No uniform today." Jenna's fingers fluttered nervously near the keyboard. "We, had some questions about the length of your stay. I extended it this morning," Camille replied. "Got the confirmation by email." Right, Jenna said, still smiling, still faking. "It's just, corporate has guidelines, and we have to verify." Camille raised an eyebrow. "Would you like to verify with the DOJ billing department?" Jenna blinked. The smile faltered. "I didn't mean, you did." Silence. Camille leaned in just enough to let her voice cut through the lobby's ambient jazz. "You're not the first person today to look at me and see something I'm not," she said. "But here's the thing, you don't have to pretend it's protocol. You can just say it. I made you uncomfortable because I don't look like the kind of black woman who books government suites." Jenna flushed. I apologize. "I don't need an apology," Camille said, stepping back. "Just better service." Upstairs, Camille showered in silence. Let the water hit her back, slide over her shoulders, pool at her feet. She had done the hard part, confronted the warden, exposed the corruption, set the wheels of justice in motion. The aftermath was always harder, because people didn't change with headlines. They changed when it hit home, and for many, she hadn't hit home. She was still just a loud woman, a threat in sneakers, a problem to be contained. Later that night, she walked across the street to a small diner. She needed coffee, not comfort food. Caffeine was her shield. She took a booth near the back and pulled out her laptop. News of Gillen's retirement was already hitting small outlets, but the tone was predictable. Warden to step down amid staffing dispute. Family member pushes back on solitary confinement decision. DOJ consultant visits county facility after youth complaints. No one had written a real headline, yet no one had said, "Black woman walks into broken system and rattles the hinges." Halfway through her cup, a family sat in the booth behind her, 2 parents and a little girl, maybe 6, in a school uniform. She had a juice box and bright pink barrettes in her hair. The kind of energy that never sat still. Camille wasn't paying attention until she heard the mother hiss, "Stop staring." The girl whispered, "But she's the lady from the phone." The mother replied, lower now, "That's not our business." A pause. Then the child spoke up, louder this time, clear, curious, unashamed. Why were the police mean to her brother? Was it 'cause he's brown like daddy? The diner went silent. Just for a second. Not because the question was cruel, but because it was pure, because no one had coached her on what not to say. Camille turned slightly. The mother's eyes widened in panic, embarrassment. She started to shush her daughter, but Camille smiled softly. "It's a good question," she said gently. "One a lot of grown-ups are too scared to ask." The mother blinked. The father, across the table, nodded slowly, almost like an apology. The girl beamed. "I knew it," she said proudly, taking another sip of her juice. When Camille left the diner, the world felt just a little warmer, not because the system was fixed, not because the headlines were right, but because one kid, one sharp, truth-telling kid had seen her, really seen her, and hadn't looked away. She got back to the hotel, opened her laptop. Her inbox had exploded. Emails from small-time journalists, from civil rights groups, from 3 public defenders she didn't know personally, but who had heard what happened at Jefferson County. One line stood out, in bold. "Can you talk about what it felt like to walk into a place that wanted to silence you and walk out louder?" Camille stared at the screen, then closed her laptop. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because she knew that question wasn't for her. It was for the next girl, who would walk into a courtroom, or a school, or a prison lobby, and feel every stare like a slap. It was for the janitor, the nurse, the little girl with the pink barrettes, and Diane. Always Diane. Camille hadn't meant to open the file that night. She sat on the edge of her hotel bed, legs still tingling from hours on her feet. The glow from the streetlight bled through the half-open blinds and splashed across the folder that had remained sealed. Since she'd left D.C., it was labeled simply, Diane 0211 Incident. Her fingers hovered above the tab. She wasn't ready. She never would be. But she peeled it open anyway. The first photo was what she expected, mugshot style. Diane in an orange jumpsuit, head tilted slightly, bruise barely forming under his left eye. But it was the next picture that made her chest tighten. Diane as a child, hair in neat twists, skin still soft with baby fat, wearing their father's old cadet jacket that hung down to his knees. He had one hand on Camille's arm, and the other held a plastic badge. "He wants to be like you," their father had said that day, camera in hand, but smarter, less stubborn. Camille had rolled her eyes then, swatted him playfully. But now the image burned. Back then, she hadn't known the price of proximity to power. Now she knew too well. It had been 8 years since their father died. A decorated veteran, Staff Sergeant Malcolm Hayes, had returned from Afghanistan with 2 Purple Hearts, a titanium knee, and a deep mistrust of men in suits. He raised his children on 3 rules. Never lie if you can afford the truth. Know the law before you fight it. When the world gets loud, get quieter and deadlier. Camille had memorized them. Diane had ignored them. And both, in their own ways, had broken them. 2 years ago, Camille had stood in front of a congressional subcommittee, arguing for the need to monitor solitary confinement in juvenile facilities. She came armed with data, footage, transcripts, and first-hand testimonies. One senator leaned back in his chair, twirling a pen, and asked, "Ms. Hayes, surely some of these kids are dangerous. Wouldn't you agree that confinement, while harsh, is sometimes necessary to protect others?" She had paused, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "My brother was once one of those dangerous kids. He broke a vending machine with his elbow at age 12. They put him in a cold cell for 26 hours with the lights on. He came out and didn't speak for a week. There had been silence, but no change, no new legislation. Just nods, and we'll take it under advisement." Camille learned something that day. Empathy doesn't legislate. Pressure does. That was the moment she decided to change roles, to leave behind the courtrooms and enter the places where policies lived and breathed, where Warden Gillens ruled unchallenged. But before that, before the mission, there was a betrayal. One so personal, it rewrote the story of Camille Hayes. 3 years earlier, Camille had applied for a DOJ fellowship under the Office of Civil Rights. She was qualified. Overqualified even. A magna cum laude graduate from Spelman. Georgetown Law. A track record in advocacy. But she was passed over for a white man named Elliot Rourke, whose greatest credential was being the nephew of someone sitting in the upper floors of the Hoover Building. She found out when she called to ask for feedback. The woman on the other end had slipped just barely and said, "Honestly, you were perfect, but we were afraid you'd come in with, too much edge." Too much edge. The phrase had stayed with her, carved like a scar behind her ribs, so Camille had stopped waiting for doors. She became the edge. The night before Diane's arrest, he had called her. She remembered every word. "Cam, I think I messed up." "Where are you?" "In the back of a patrol car." "They say I didn't signal. Did you say anything smart?" "No, I had the cadet sticker on my windshield. They didn't care." "Stay calm. Don't resist. Don't raise your voice. Say yes, sir. I did all that. And? They're still taking me in." He had sounded confused. Not scared. Just confused. Like the rules didn't work anymore. Like the uniform no longer protected him. The official report said, resisting lawful stop. Possible theft suspicion due to match in vehicle description. Unofficially, Diane had been the wrong color in the wrong zip code at the wrong time. And when they took him to Jefferson County, no one notified Camille until he had already been placed in solitary for protective custody. Protective from whom? No one answered. Now, Camille stared at the file's last page. A psychologist's note, typed hastily. Subject exhibits signs of dissociation. Repeatedly says, "I did everything right." Refuses to sleep with lights off. Possible PTSD indicators. Camille folded the page slowly. Her hands were shaking because she knew that phrase. It was the same thing she had said into her pillow the night her DOJ fellowship vanished. "I did everything right." And the system had replied, "We don't care." The next morning, Camille returned to the jail, not for interviews, not for confrontation, but because she had promised Diane she would come every day. And someone had to see him not as a name in a file, not as an inmate number, but as the boy who once wore a plastic badge and believed his big sister could fix anything. When she walked into the visitation room, Diane was already waiting. This time not behind glass. He was thinner, eyes sunken. But his smile, still there. She sat across from him. Didn't speak. He reached across the table. Their fingers touched. And that for now was enough. There's a moment, always, when power stumbles over itself. When those who wear authority like a badge of honor accidentally trip on their own assumptions. Camille saw it happen again and again, especially in places like Jefferson County Correctional Facility. But nothing could have prepared her for what came the day after Diane was returned to general population. Camille had returned to the facility for a routine review of medical logs. The front desk now treated her with a brittle form of respect, polite on the surface, but laced with unspoken bitterness. She didn't care. Let them simmer. Truth had already boiled over. She was being escorted by a young, stocky officer named DeLuca, who tried his best to appear unimpressed by her presence. He walked fast, spoke little, and opened doors with too much force. When they reached the intake wing, a civilian in a suit stepped forward, a white man in his late 40s with perfect hair, an expensive briefcase, and the demeanor of someone used to getting what he wanted. "Excuse me," he said to DeLuca, glancing at Camille as if she were furniture. "I was told I'd be meeting with the DOJ representative." DeLuca blinked. This is her." The man's brow furrowed. No. I meant the lead consultant, the one in charge of oversight." Camille extended her hand. "Camille Hayes." "That's me." The man stared for a second too long, then cleared his throat. "Oh, well, I suppose that works." Camille didn't flinch. "You suppose correctly." He tried to recover. Well, I was just telling Officer DeLuca how surprised I was by the media's reaction. It's gotten overblown, don't you think? Camille smiled politely. Did you read the incident reports? He waved a hand. I skimmed. It's just the optics. It's all become very theatrical. A pause. She leaned in, voice low and even. Optics don't bruise ribs. Or break wrists. DeLuca tried not to smirk. Later that day, Camille found herself alone in the staff lounge, waiting for access to archived video files. The room smelled of stale coffee and something microwaved too many times. On the wall was a corkboard full of birthday notices and a dry erase calendar that hadn't been updated since March. A young officer walked in, saw her sitting alone, and did a double take. Are you supposed to be in here? He asked. She looked up from her file. Are you? He blinked, unsure whether to laugh or be offended. I'm just messing with you, she added dryly. But if you're making coffee, I take mine black. He turned pink. Yeah, right. Minutes later, he spilled it all over the floor trying to pour without looking directly at her. Camille didn't say a word. She just handed him a napkin. That same afternoon, she attended a closed-door debrief with several jail staff, including Gillen's replacement, an interim administrator named Beatrice Harkness. Harkness was an older woman with a sharp bob and even sharper eyes. She seemed competent, but cautious. As Camille walked in, one of the staffers, a man from accounting, whispered to another, "That's the woman who had Gillen marched out. Heard she used to be a lawyer or something." The other replied, "I thought she was his sister. You sure she's not just some activist?" Camille took a seat, then slowly turned her chair to face them directly. "Hi," she said, voice clear. "I'm the one who got the federal marshals called. I'm also the one who filed the memo that'll be on your desk next week. And yes, I used to be a lawyer. But mostly I'm the reason your break room has microphones now." Silence. A few people shifted in their chairs. One even dropped their pen. Camille leaned back. "Glad we cleared that up." But the most unexpected moment came the following morning. She had stopped by a local cafe before heading to the facility, wearing sunglasses and a long coat. As she waited for her coffee, a group of middle-aged men in work vests sat nearby, chatting loudly about the woman from the jail. One of them said, "I heard she's one of those liberal TikTok lawyers. Probably doesn't even have a real job." Another replied, "Nah, I saw her on the news." She looked pissed, like she wanted to shut down the whole damn prison. At that moment, the barista called, "Camille?" She stepped forward. Every one of the men went quiet. She took her coffee, turned toward them, and with a straight face said, "Actually, I'm more of a YouTube person." They blinked. Then one chuckled nervously. Another said, "Well damn, good on you. Heard you shook things up." She raised her cup. "Just doing quality control." Then she walked out, leaving behind a table full of grown men wondering if they'd just been roasted politely by a federal agent. Justice had many faces. Sometimes it smiled, sometimes it served its coffee black, and sometimes it walked into a room full of doubt and made people spill their lunch trying not to look foolish, because the most powerful kind of authority wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was the kind that made people nervous with just a look and the name they'd never forget. Camille Hayes. Night was always the hardest. The days were full of noise boots, buzzers, voices clipped and cold, but night brought silence, and in that silence, memory became a predator. Camille sat on her hotel balcony, wrapped in a blanket too thin for the spring chill. Her laptop was open on her lap but untouched. Below, the streetlight splashed gold onto the parking lot. A group of teenagers skated through the cracked asphalt, their laughter echoing like distant ghosts. She watched them and remembered another night. She was 14 then. Their father had just come home from his second deployment. He walked with a limp one they all pretended not to see. That night, she knocked on his door. She couldn't sleep. Part of her feared he might disappear again. He was sitting on the floor in the dark, leaning against the dresser. His gun sat in his lap, not held, just there. Camille froze. He didn't look up but said softly, "You ever been so tired your bones feel like they're humming?" She didn't understand back then, but now she did. She knew exactly what humming bones felt like. Diane got beaten up at school for the first time when he was 7. The teacher brushed it off as boys being boys. The second time, they called him a troublemaker. The third time they called the cops. He was 10. That night, Camille stood in front of their mom's bathroom mirror, practicing what she would say in court. No law degree, just fury. But even then, she understood the rules. Speak clearly. Don't cry. Don't let them call you emotional. Wear navy. Say sir. Say thank you. Swallow the insult. Smile with your teeth closed. The trauma wasn't a single moment. It was an accumulation, a slow erosion of the self, like being buried alive beneath a mountain of pleasantries. On her mother's last night, Camille had held her hand and promised she would protect Diane, but she hadn't. Not fast enough. Not in time to stop the cell, the bruises, the nights with the lights always on. She opened the bottom drawer of her suitcase and pulled out a letter she had never sent. It was for Diane, written months before the arrest, before the warden, before the world flipped upside down. She read it out loud to herself. Diane, there's something I never said when you were old enough to hear it. I was too proud. Too afraid. But here it is now. I watched you grow up and believed you were untouchable. That if I did everything right, if I was smart enough, loud enough, successful enough, they wouldn't touch you. I thought my degree would be your armor. My name would be your shield. I was wrong. They don't care who you love, what you dream of, or how many times you followed the rules. They only care if you fit the story they've already written. And you never did. You were too good for that. Too kind. Too much like, Dad, I'm sorry it took me this long to fight with everything I've got, but I'm here now. And I swear I won't. Stop. Not until your name means more than a case number. Not until the world sees what I see. You hold. Unbroken. Still standing. Love, Cam. Her voice cracked on the last word, not from tears. Camille didn't cry, but her breath hitched like grief had been waiting quietly in the corner, biding its time. She folded the letter, slipped it into her coat pocket. Tomorrow she would give it to Diane, not because he needed the words, but because she did, because sometimes love isn't a grand gesture. Sometimes it's a quiet promise in the dark that no matter what the world does to your body, your spirit is still yours. Sacred. Hold. And someone out there still believes you're worth saving, especially when the system doesn't. Especially then. It began with an envelope. Not a dramatic one, no wax seal, no classified stamp. Just a plain manila folder dropped anonymously on Camille's hotel doorstep. No return address, no note. But when she picked it up, something shifted, something cold, something instinctual. She closed the door slowly behind her and opened it at the desk, hands steady. Inside were 12 printed pages and 3 photographs, copies of logs, emails, internal memos, all dated weeks before Dion's arrest. The contents stopped her breath. Diane had been flagged. Not for a crime, not for suspicion, but for a pilot. PROGRAM, a quiet partnership between the Department of Corrections and a private data analytics firm, Halvertech Solutions. The program used predictive behavior models to identify potential future threats among minority youth enrolled in military or law enforcement training programs. Diane had scored high. Too high. He'd been labeled at risk for ideological defection, a code phrase that, in plain English, meant he asked too many questions. He challenged orders. He showed signs of thinking for himself. They hadn't arrested him because he broke the law. They arrested him because he broke the algorithm, Camille read the same lines over and over, her pulse roaring in her ears. The emails were from senior officers. One mentioned observing subject 042 for conditioning breakdown. Another authorized containment trial, short-term solitary recommended. Subject 042 was Diane. They had tested him, like a lab rat. The bruises, the isolation, the silence. All of it had been designed, not as punishment, but as data. Camille's hands trembled. She reached for her phone. Dialed a contact she hadn't used in years. Edgar? It's Cam. I need a trace. On a program called Nexus Flag, I think. I think they ran it on my brother. There was a pause. Then Edgar's voice dropped to a whisper. Camille. Shut your laptop. Now. Don't open anything else. I'll call you back from a landline. He hung up. She sat frozen. In her mind, memories reassembled themselves. The way the officer who arrested Dion had stared at the cadet sticker on his windshield. The way no charges were officially filed for hours. The way the jail refused to explain who authorized solitary. They'd known all along. Camille stepped out onto the balcony. The street below looked the same, calm, ordinary. But the world had changed. She knew now what she was really up against. This wasn't about a Bacchaeist, corrupt warden. This wasn't about one jail. This was systemic, funded, structured. Designed. And her brother had been used to test how far a black boy in uniform could be pushed before breaking. She thought of her father, of the medals, of the flag folded at his funeral. She thought of how they told them, be better, be twice as good, follow the rules. And then she thought, they were never rules, just camouflage. Later that night, a knock came at the hotel door. It was Sims, the janitor from the jail. Her hands shook as she handed Camille a flash drive. I wasn't gonna say anything, she whispered. But I seen change the logs. Heard him say your boy was a behavioral marker, whatever that means. I thought it was just cruelty. Now I know it was protocol. Camille nodded. Double quotes, thank you, she said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't crack. It was just steel. That night, Camille didn't sleep. She drafted her report. She uploaded the documents. She scheduled interviews. And in the subject line of every email, she typed the same word: exposed. She was done playing nice. Tomorrow, they'd learn what happens when the woman you tried to silence becomes the voice you can't ignore. The storm was coming, and Camille Hayes had just lit the fuse. It didn't happen all at once. Change never does. But once Camille dropped the report, real names, real documents, real voices, it started to ripple. First, a local journalist picked it up, a former Marine whose younger brother had once been arrested for loitering. He read Camille's report at 2 a.m. and published a full expose by 6. Then came the podcasters, the human rights attorneys, the civil liberties watchdogs. Hashtags trended. Hashtag flagged and forgotten. Hashtag Hayes report. Hashtag the Diane Files. Cable news got hold of it next. Most danced around the central truth, still clinging to neutrality. But one anchor, a black woman with silver locks and a voice like velvet over steel, stared into the camera and said, "We don't need another apology. We need a reckoning." The next day, Camille stepped out of the hotel and into a crowd. Reporters, students, elders, strangers, holding up hand-painted signs. Diane is all of U.S. Stop testing our children, Camille. We got wayo. She didn't cry. But something in her cracked open. For years she'd been fighting alone. Now, voices rose with hers. At the jail, Sims stood in front of news cameras, face bare, voice shaking but loud. They told me to shut up. Said it wasn't my business, but you know what? When I clean blood off concrete, it becomes my business. Her words went viral in less than an hour. Inside, staff turnover began. Whistleblowers emerged. 2 guards resigned. One issued a public statement. I followed orders because I was told this was safety protocol. Now I see it was cowardice. The governor called for an emergency review. And Camille? She was summoned to testify, not behind closed doors this time, but in front of Congress. When she entered the chamber, people stood. Not all, but enough. Diane sat behind her, his arm still in a soft cast. He wore a suit that didn't quite fit, and a stare that didn't flinch. The hearing began. One congressman, skeptical, leaned forward. Ms. Hayes, you claim this program was deliberately targeting young men of color. But isn't it possible this was just poor oversight? Camille leaned into the mic. It's not poor oversight if they build it to be invisible. She paused. Silence isn't the glitch. It's the goal. A hush fell over the chamber. Another representative, older, white, cleared his throat. What do you want from us, Ms. Hayes? She didn't blink. Truth, accountability, and to make sure no one ever has to write a letter to their brother explaining why the world broke him for being brave. The room stayed quiet, but this time it was the kind of silence that listens. Outside, a child no older than 10 stood holding a cardboard sign that read, "My brother's not a threat. He's my hero." Camille knelt beside him. What's your name? She asked. Marcus, he said proudly. She smiled. Then you're the reason we're here. And in that moment, under the marble pillars of American power, the truth stopped being just a headline. It became a movement. And Camille Hayes, once invisible, became undeniable. 6 months later, the sign outside Jefferson County Correctional Facility came down. In its place stood a new one, Jefferson Center for Restorative Justice. The bricks were the same. The steel doors hadn't changed, but inside the rules had. Solitary confinement was banned. Independent audits were quarterly. And for the first time in the facility's history, a civilian oversight board with real power met every month in the rec room. Camille never attended those meetings. Not because she didn't care, but because it wasn't her name that needed to be on the walls. It was Diane's, and it was a mural now covered one wing of the visiting area, a portrait of Diane in cadet blues, standing tall beside a quote, "They tried to test me. I taught them what resistance looks like." Diane didn't say much the day it was unveiled. He just stood there, next to Camille, nodding as a group of students toured the space. One boy asked if Diane was famous. "No," Diane said, "just seen." Camille smiled. Weeks later, Camille returned to D.C. She wasn't the same woman who had once stood on marble steps with a folder full of unanswered calls. She had been offered promotions, press deals, think tank seats. She turned most of them down. Instead, she started something small, a foundation, named after their father, the Malcolm Initiative. It funded legal clinics for young cadets, provided mentorship for families navigating the justice system, and trained janitorial and food staff at detention centers on how to file protected grievances. Because Camille knew change didn't just come from podiums. It came from the people who mopped the floors where the blood fell. One afternoon, she received a letter in a child's handwriting. It read, "Dear Miss Camille, my teacher said you saved a boy's life. I want to do that when I grow up. Do I need to go to law school? Can I just start now?" She framed it. Next to it, she placed a photo of her and Diane, sitting outside the old jail, laughing. No suits, no mics. Just two siblings who had survived something bigger than a building. Sometimes, Camille would walk through neighborhoods where no one knew her name. She liked it that way. But every now and then, a stranger would nod, not with fear, not with reverence. Just with recognition. As if to say, "I see you. And because of you, I know they have to see me too." The system wasn't fixed, not entirely, but the silence had cracked. And in its place, voices were rising, not shouting. Just refusing to go unheard. Because justice isn't a finish line. It's a frequency. And finally, Camille Hayes had made sure the world was tuned in. Camille didn't come to destroy a system. She came to protect the one person she loved most, and in doing so, uncovered what so many tried to keep hidden. This wasn't just a story about power, it was about silence. And what happens when someone finally decides not to be silent anymore? If this story moved you, if it made you think, or made you feel, consider subscribing. Because there are more voices like Camille's out there, and they deserve to be heard. Thank you for watching. Stay loud, stay human.